Last week's update, version 1.2, brought some significant boosts to the martial arts of the different weapons, at least in terms of damage. So this has led to mystic skills becoming less of a priority, less of an overall damage source compared to your actual martial art abilities. So I've gone and retested all of the main damage abilities versus what I had before. And this very importantly now includes the total cast time of the ability versus the amount of damage you can output. Thus we get the amount of DPS, and we can compare that versus the amount of vitality it costs for that ability and whether or not that cast time actually fits within our rotation. For example, with the Silkbind Jade, the Umbrella and Fan, we have a new rotation due to those buffs and changes to the martial skills. And this rotation does not allow for a lot of time for mystic skills anymore. Otherwise, they just end up losing us damage output because our martial skills are significantly more impactful than those overall mystic skills. So I'll leave a link to this sheet in the video description. And what we find when we test out the tier 4 versions of these mystic skills is pretty interesting. In the past, I used to use Drunken Poet with Dragon's Breath, and that's no longer really worth it. We can find the exact cast time by making a screen recording like this, doing the combo. This is the 5 hits of Drunken Poet with the Dragon's Breath at the start. We then add it to my editing software where we can look at this frame by frame. We find the first frame when our UI pops up, meaning we've just started casting the skill. We let the combo play through, and as soon as we land that last hit, we need to find that frame of when that last damage floater pops up, and we can see the total cast time right here, which I have input into the table, for example with Dragon's Breath and Drunken Poet. And I've done that for all of them. We can compare the amount of effective damage that these abilities can do, excluding your additional stats and the randomness that comes with them. And we can compare everything with that, because all of these abilities should be equally affected by your stats no matter what, as they all have the percentage of your physical attack plus a physical attack bonus, plus then your attribute damage. And then this is going to be affected by crit, abrasion, precision, and affinity. But again, all equally throughout all the mystic skills. So we get a baseline here. And we make sure that these amount of hits are exactly what we're getting. For example, Combustions on Dragon's Breath is going to be a total of 16 hits, as you simply see by checking in game, breathing on the target, letting all the ticks go through, and checking here. 16 hits of Combustion, plus 1 of Dragon's Breath because I cancelled the second hit. And we've accounted for that in other variants. For example here, when we cancel that second hit of Dragon's Breath, we only get the first hit, but our cast time gets down to 1.4 seconds. This can be reduced half again if you're already intoxicated, and so can immediately breathe on your target. This can be done by, say, animation cancelling Drunken Poet, which people do, thus allowing you to achieve a much higher effective DPS score, which is damage divided by the amount of time it takes to actually gain that damage. Yes, you have to account for Dragon's Breath is going to take that time, the 8 seconds, to actually do its full damage, but that is not time taken up by casting abilities. You can go and do other abilities in your rotation while you get all that free extra damage. So what we find when we look at all the other abilities, Dragon's Breath appears to be still the best ability to be using in terms of cast time and the amount of damage it gives. You can cancel after the first hit when you get the dot on the target for then only a 1.4 second cast time, or if you're already intoxicated, then you can just immediately start casting it and cancel after 0.7 seconds. Dragon's Breath then is followed by, very interestingly, Leaping Toad, which is something I didn't notice in my previous testing. Not the full cast of Leaping Toad, just the version where you get the main hit. So you're going to turn into the toad and then jump at your target like that. And this can be done really quick, 1.35 seconds. With the cast time data on this sheet, all these tests are done with animation cancelling at the end. So rather than letting the full animation play out once you've actually done the damage with the ability, you simply just cancel it so that you can continue to cast other abilities, thus shortening the cast time and improving your DPS. And so many Mystic skills are like this. You will need to practice animation cancelling those end effects in order to be the most effective. Even Soaring Spin has this. Like, it's so much faster when you cancel to chain another ability versus letting the whole animation play out. And keep in mind, some are pretty great in terms of, like Soaring Spin, you cast this and you can immediately chain another ability. You don't have to parry to cancel it. Just pressing another ability will automatically do it. But that's unlike Leaping Toad. This won't let you. You're going to have to finish the animation before you can cast another ability. Unless, of course, that ability is special like Emerald Barrier. This does let you cancel that animation. But yes, in most cases, if you don't have an ability to animation cancel, you all have parry to be able to do so. And you can do that with Leaping Toad. So with all that in mind, you may still be confused as to what exact abilities to be using. And well, I can't give you a perfect answer because it's going to depend on your rotation. I can show you an example with Silkbind Jade and why using Soaring Spin, Dragon's Breath or Leaping Toad is the optimal way to go. Maybe this can help with your different weapon setup. So the reason for this is our rotation now is very tight. We do not have a lot of time to use Mystic skills like we did in the past. Before, I was recommending Dragon's Breath plus Drunken's Poet, and that was because you had some downtime with regards to your martial skills. They have long cooldowns, and you weren't necessarily being able to chain them like you can now. Now our buffs last longer, and we have a new pursuit skill on the fan, which allows us to gain even further damage buffs, along with using the Star Reacher Inner Way for the physical damage buff with that ability. And in order to maintain this buff, you gotta cast it pretty frequently, along with capitalizing on the new buff that we got to the Unfading Flower with the Lingering Bone. So we only have about 3 seconds for Mystic skills in the rotation, and this rotation is about every 12-13 seconds. So with that in mind, we can look through these Mystic skills on this list and we can find ones that are going to deal the most amount of damage within that about 3-second cast time. So Soaring Spin plus Leaping Toad end up as really viable options here. The amount of damage they deal in that cast time is better than pretty much any alternative, other than using Dragon's Breath instead of, say, Leaping Toad. The reason you wouldn't want to use Leaping Toad plus Dragon's Breath is because you just look at the total amount of damage. If you add up this nearly 700% plus 500%, that's 1200%, versus if we add Leaping Toad plus Dragon's Breath, that's less than 1100%. And the total amount of cast time does not differ much. So even though the total amount of DPS of Leaping Toad and Dragon's Breath may be higher than Soaring Spin is just better than both of those when we take into consideration the cast time restraints and how often we're actually going to be able to use these abilities. In a perfect world, you might be able to squeeze in all 3, and maybe I can if I get my timing tighter, but it's unlikely. And even though Dragon's Breath might be slightly better in terms of damage output versus Leaping Toad, this cast time, 1.44, can make you miss the rotation versus 1.35, meaning your spring shot buff drops off and then you can't maintain it at 5 stacks, which you really want to do to give that 20% damage boost to your charger skills. So this is the kind of thinking you have to do to find out what works best with your build, not necessarily just looking at, say, only the total DPS score. This won't tell you the full picture. So I hope this helps some of you out there. That sheet will be linked in the video description. Another very special thank you to all these channel members, and we'll see you guys around.